Dawn broke over Rome on a winter morning, thick with smoke and cold, the kind that seeps into stone and bone alike. It was the 8th hour before sunrise, the year counted by consuls long dead, and the city already breathed with rumor. Somewhere near the Forum, a girl stood barefoot on frozen marble, no older than 10, her breath trembling in the air. Around her gathered priests, senators, and silent families, perhaps 200 witnesses, their faces fixed not in celebration but restraint. When the Pontifex Maximus lifted his hand and pointed, the sound of the city seemed to stop. In that instant, a childhood ended, and a life of sacred danger began. She did not understand the words spoken over her head, only the sudden stillness of her mother, the tightening grip of a father who knew he no longer had the right to hold her. Rome called it selection. The law called it fate. Between 6 and 10 years old, born whole, born legitimate, both parents living, unmarked by scandal, she had passed every requirement without ever choosing to try. The Romans believed purity could be identified like metal in a flame, tested by lineage and flesh. What they did not say aloud was simpler and crueler. The state needed a body it could trust, and a silence it could control. Led away along the Sacra Via, she crossed the threshold of ordinary life. No chains bound her wrists, yet every step carried the weight of 30 years already decided. Ahead waited the Atrium of Vesta, a house without laughter, standing beside the round temple where an eternal fire burned low and constant. That flame was Rome itself, they said. If it died, the city would follow, and so the girl would be shaped into its guardian, taught to walk softly, to speak little, to erase desire before it could even form. The honor was immense, so was the terror. Vestal Virgins were lifted above other women, freed from fathers, freed from husbands, allowed to own property and condemn men with a word. Crowds would part for her, magistrates would bow. But reverence is not safety, it is exposure. Every gaze became a test, every whisper a threat. Rome did not choose her for who she was, it chose her for what it feared to lose. In that fear, innocence was sharpened into a weapon against time. The days that followed erased her name first. In the Atrium of Vesta, walls of pale stone enclosed a life measured not in years, but in obedience.
At dawn, she rose with the others, 6 girls at different stages of transformation, their hair bound, their steps synchronized by habit rather than command. The city outside roared with carts, arguments, iron striking iron. But inside, sound was disciplined into whispers. Rome believed silence cultivated purity. In truth, it cultivated fear. Her training began immediately. The eldest Vestals taught her how to carry water from the sacred spring, how to prepare the salted flour used in state sacrifices, how to walk without haste, how to lower her eyes without appearing ashamed. Every motion had meaning. Every mistake had consequence. For 10 years she would learn, absorbing ritual as muscle memory, until thought itself became unnecessary. The priests watched closely, recording gestures, correcting posture, reminding her that the fire never slept, neither could she. At night, when the lamps dimmed, she learned the deeper lesson. The vow was not simply abstinence, it was erasure. Desire was not forbidden because it was sinful, but because it was dangerous. A Vestal's body was not her own, it was a symbol, and symbols cannot be allowed complexity. She was taught to think of herself as a vessel, empty, sealed, untouchable. Rome's survival depended on that illusion. Outside these walls, wars were fought and lost. Consuls marched with tens of thousands and returned with half. Crops failed. Plagues whispered through alleys. When catastrophe struck, Romans searched not only the skies, but the temple. If the sacred flame flickered, anxiety spread like rot. People did not ask whether the fire failed by chance. They asked which Vestal had failed Rome. Discipline followed this belief with ruthless logic. If the flame went out, punishment came swiftly, administered by the Pontifex Maximus himself. Ancient accounts described the ritual without poetry. The guilty Vestal veiled, stripped of insignia, beaten in darkness with rods. No crowd, no witnesses. Pain delivered privately, as if to preserve dignity, even while destroying it. Rome did not need spectacle. It needed control.
Rumor was more dangerous than flame. A glance held too long. A word overheard. A dream confessed to the wrong ear. Investigations began in silence, conducted by men whose authority came from gods they claimed to interpret. Accusation alone could isolate a Vestal, turn reverence into suspicion overnight. She learned quickly that survival depended not on innocence, but on appearing flawless.
Thus the years pressed inward. 10 years of learning bled into 10 of service. The girl disappeared entirely, replaced by a presence both exalted and trapped. She stood at the heart of Rome, closer to power than any emperor, and yet closer still to annihilation. For when a Vestal fell, Rome did not punish her like a criminal, it erased her like a mistake. By her 20th year, Rome no longer saw the child, it saw the symbol perfected. Draped in white, her hair arranged in the ancient style, she moved through the forum like a living omen. Crowds fell silent as she passed. Prisoners condemned to death prayed for her glance, for it was said that if a Vestal met a man on the way to execution, his sentence could be overturned. Her presence could halt violence with a step, sanctify treaties with a word, and steady a city trembling under the weight of empire. Yet this power came with a paradox sharper than any blade. The higher she stood, the further she could fall. History records the year 216 BCE as one of blood and terror. Hannibal crushed Roman legions at Cannae, leaving perhaps 50,000 citizens dead in a single afternoon. Panic infected the city. The gods, Romans believed, had turned away, and when the gods were angry, Rome searched for defilement within. The College of Pontiffs convened not to question generals, but virgins. 2 Vestals were accused that year, Floronia and Opimia. Their crime was incestum, the ultimate violation, a wound not to flesh but to fate. Sources do not tell us who accused them, only that the rumors were believed. In times of catastrophe, belief mattered more than proof. Floronia chose death by her own hand, a final assertion of control in a system that allowed none. Opimia was less fortunate. The trial was brief, hidden from the people it claimed to protect. No advocate spoke for her, no testimony survives. Judgment, once declared, was irreversible. Rome could not execute her openly. Her blood was sacred. To spill it would be another sacrilege. So the city turned to ritualized annihilation, a punishment designed to appear merciful while being absolute. On the day of her condemnation, the city fell unnaturally quiet. She was led through the streets veiled, barefoot, dressed as if for a ceremony of honor. Romans watched in silence, not from compassion, but from fear. To acknowledge her suffering too openly was to question the system that demanded it. The procession moved toward the Colline Gate, beyond which lay the Campus Sceleratus, the field of the wicked. Even the name was a warning. There, a chamber had been prepared beneath the earth. A bed, a lamp, bread, water, enough to sustain the lie that Rome was not killing her. When she descended the steps, no one followed. The ladder was withdrawn. Earth and stone sealed the entrance. Rome turned away. What happened next was never recorded. The law did not care. By leaving her with food, Rome claimed innocence. The gods, they said, would decide her fate. But gods require breath to judge, and the air underground was finite. In preserving its purity, Rome sacrificed a human being to silence. The ground above her tomb was leveled and smoothed, as if nothing had ever disturbed it. Within days, life in Rome resumed its brutal rhythm. Markets reopened, courts convened. Prayers were offered for victory, not forgiveness. The Vestal's name was spoken less and less, until it vanished entirely. This was not an accident. Erasure was part of the punishment. Rome did not merely kill the fallen symbol, it annihilated her memory, sealing it beneath ritual and law. Yet fear lingered. The execution had not ended the anxiety that gripped the city after Cannae. If anything, it sharpened it. The logic was simple and terrifying. If even the most sacred could fall, No one was safe. Vestals still walked the forum, their steps measured, their faces serene. But now every movement was watched with renewed intensity. The flame in Vesta's temple burned brighter, fed excessively, guarded day and night. A single spark failing could trigger another search for guilt. For the surviving Vestals, punishment became psychological before it was ever physical. Sleep was shallow, dreams were dangerous. A careless word, a misunderstood gesture, could echo like a confession. They learned to police not only their bodies, but their thoughts. Rome demanded purity not as a state of being, but as a performance without flaw. And performances, sustained long enough, break the performer. The contradiction at the heart of the institution became impossible to ignore. Vestals were freed from male authority, yet utterly controlled by it. They could testify in court without oath, yet had no voice when accused. They were honored as living embodiments of Rome's virtue, yet punished as threats to its survival. Power and vulnerability occupied the same fragile space, and any imbalance could prove fatal.
Centuries passed, but the pattern repeated. In 114 BCE, 3 more Vestals were accused. Again, Rome faced internal unrest, military tension, fear of divine abandonment. Again, virgins were blamed. 2 were buried alive. The 3rd was acquitted, then retried, then condemned. The message was unmistakable. In moments of crisis, Rome did not look outward for enemies. It looked inward, toward those it had elevated beyond humanity. By the late Republic, skepticism crept in. Some began to whisper that these punishments were less about gods and more about control. But whispers did not change law. The rituals continued because they had to. Rome had bound its identity to symbols it could not afford to question. And so the Vestal walked on, white against stone, guarding a fire that consumed quietly. She knew the stories. She knew the chamber beneath the earth awaited not criminals, but failures of expectation. Her survival depended on perfection, and perfection, in a world built on fear, was the rarest miracle of all. By the time her 30 years neared their end, she had outlived most of the men who once held power over her. Councils had risen and fallen, laws had shifted, enemies had become allies, and allies enemies again. Yet the fire still burned, and she still stood beside it, thinner now, harder, her face carved by discipline rather than age. Rome called this endurance virtue. She knew it as survival. In theory, freedom waited at the end of service. A Vestal who completed her term could leave the atrium, marry, build a household, reclaim a life delayed but not erased. In practice, few did. After decades of isolation, the world beyond the temple felt dangerous, loud, and unstructured. Some married and were haunted by whispers that intimacy would anger the gods. Others remained in the house voluntarily, unable to abandon the identity that had consumed them. Rome never forced them to stay. It never had to. The psychological cost was invisible but profound. From childhood, fear had been her tutor. Fear of error, fear of suspicion, fear of becoming a symbol of disaster. Even after release, that fear lingered like ash in the lungs. She had learned to measure every breath against consequence, every choice against catastrophe. Freedom, when it came, felt like another test she was unprepared to pass. The institution itself began to decay as Rome changed. Emperors replaced kings, then claimed divinity for themselves. New cults arrived, old gods lost clarity.
Yet the Vestals remained, relics of a moral order that demanded sacrifice without mercy. Their punishments became rarer, but the threat never vanished. The chamber beneath the earth was always there, sealed but remembered. When Christianity rose and the old temples closed, the fire of Vesta was finally extinguished, not by negligence, but by decree. No scourging followed, no burial. Rome had changed its gods, but not its instinct. Control simply found new symbols, new bodies to discipline in the name of purity. What remains is not the ritual, but the lesson. The Vestal Virgin was never merely a priestess. She was a mirror. In her, Rome saw its ideals and its terror reflected back. The city demanded innocence, then punished the impossibility of sustaining it. It sanctified obedience and called it virtue, even as it destroyed those who embodied it too imperfectly. War leaves ruins you can see. Institutions like this leave ruins inside the human mind. And those ruins, buried quietly beneath reverence and law, endure far longer than any fallen wall. Long after the last Vestal walked the Forum, the logic that governed her life survived in Rome's bones. The city had learned, through centuries of blood and ritual, that fear was a more reliable adhesive than love. The Vestals were its most refined experiment. Take children before they can choose. Surround them with honor so thick it feels like protection, then bind them with laws so absolute that resistance becomes unthinkable. Rome did not invent this method, but it perfected it. To understand why the Vestals endured for over 1,000 years, one must look not at religion, but at anxiety. Rome was never secure. It expanded too fast, ruled too many, balanced constantly on the edge of collapse. Every famine, every defeat, every strange omen demanded explanation. The Vestal Virgin provided one. If disaster struck, it was because purity had failed. And if purity had failed, someone could be punished. The system offered emotional relief through sacrifice. Inside the atrium, this truth was never spoken, but it was felt. The older Vestals taught discipline, but what they passed down was vigilance. Watch yourself. Watch the others. Do not attract attention. Do not disappear into it either. The most dangerous place was the space in between, where ambiguity lived. Rome hated ambiguity. It preferred graves. The Vestals' bodies became political terrain. Chastity was no longer a private vow, but a public asset.
Men who coveted power learned to fear them instead. A Vestal's accusation could end a career. Her presence could invalidate contracts. Yet this authority did not belong to her as a person. It belonged to the office, and the moment she was suspected of defilement, it vanished completely. Power, in Rome, was always conditional. The silence surrounding the buried was deliberate. No monuments marked the Campus Celeratus. No anniversaries recalled those entombed alive. Memory itself was treated as contamination. By forgetting the victims, Rome preserved the illusion that the system worked, that the gods were satisfied, that order had been restored. But beneath the stones, another legacy formed. Philosophers questioned, historians hesitated, then recorded. Livy wrote with restraint, Plutarch with discomfort. Even in antiquity, the ritual unsettled those who described it. A punishment without blood, yet saturated in cruelty. A justice that claimed piety while practicing terror. The Vestal Virgin stands now not as an icon of devotion, but as evidence. Evidence of what happens when a state confuses morality with control, when symbols matter more than lives, when fear becomes law. Rome believed it was protecting itself. In truth, it was revealing itself. The deeper truth, buried beneath ritual and reverence, was that Rome did not trust its gods without proof. Faith alone was never enough. It demanded constant reassurance, visible and human, and the Vestal Virgin provided that reassurance by existing under pressure. Her discipline was meant to convince the city that order still held, that chaos could be restrained by sacrifice. When she succeeded, Rome took no notice. When she failed, or was believed to fail, Rome responded with terror disguised as law. For the common people, the Vestal was both comfort and warning. Mothers pointed her out to their children as an example of honor, while silently praying their daughters would never be chosen. Men lowered their eyes when she passed, not only from reverence, but from fear of implication. To be associated too closely with her was dangerous. Distance was safety. Even purity required boundaries. Inside the political sphere, accusations against Vestals often surfaced during instability, military defeats, civil unrest, factional struggle. The timing was never accidental. Charging a Vestal redirected public anger away from generals and senators toward a powerless symbol.
The state could appear decisive without threatening those who truly held power. In this way, the Vestal became Rome's pressure valve, absorbing fear so others could rule unchallenged. This made the institution resilient, but also brittle. It relied on the illusion that innocence could be maintained indefinitely under surveillance. Yet surveillance itself corrodes innocence. Every glance becomes suspect. Every delay feels intentional. Over time, even the priests tasked with protection became investigators, searching not for truth, but for reassurance that order still existed. When reassurance failed, punishment followed. The horror of burial alive lay not only in the death, but in its impersonality. No executioner raised a hand,
no blade fell. The state simply closed the door and walked away. Responsibility dissolved into ritual. Rome could tell itself it had not killed. It had merely observed divine procedure. This abdication of guilt was its most dangerous innovation. Modern eyes see cruelty. Roman eyes saw necessity, and that difference matters. It explains how a civilization capable of law, engineering, and philosophy could also normalize silence over suffering. The Vestal Virgin was not a victim in Roman thought. She was a failed safeguard, a mechanism that had broken and needed removal. When the last fire went out and the temple doors closed forever, Rome did not mourn the women who had lived and died within those walls. It mourned the certainty they once provided. In losing them, the city lost a mirror that had reflected its fears back in manageable form. What remained was a question Rome never answered, only buried. How many lives can be consumed in the name of stability before the foundation itself becomes hollow? By the time the empire shifted and pagan temples fell to Christian decree, the Atrium Vestae stood as a silent witness to centuries of devotion, fear, and brutality. Its halls, once vibrant with ritual, now echoed with absence. The fire that had symbolized Rome's eternal life had been extinguished, leaving only shadows and memory. The Vestals themselves, the few who remained, had aged into obscurity or vanished entirely. Yet their legacy, invisible yet pervasive, lingered in the very marrow of the city. Every law, every act of control, every fear of divine disfavor traced its lineage back to them. Rome had survived, yet in surviving, it carried the weight of its own terror.
To understand the Vestals is to understand the machinery of power itself, how societies manufacture symbols, how they demand perfection from chosen individuals, and how they conceal cruelty beneath veneration. The buried virgins, erased in life and memory, were a cautionary echo, reminding each generation that reverence could mask violence and that law could sanctify death. Historians who later chronicled these events grappled with discomfort. Livy, Plutarch, and other annalists included details, but often with a moralized distance. They recorded incidents of incestum, burial alive, and private scourging, yet struggled to reconcile these with Rome's self-image as a civilization of justice and virtue. That tension between recorded reality and civic mythology is the space in which the Vestals' true story survives. In the intersection of faith, fear, and power, their lives and deaths illuminate a Rome both majestic and monstrous. The psychological imprint of the institution extended beyond its own walls. Families of chosen girls lived in perpetual anxiety, knowing that selection could bring prestige, but also profound loss. Citizens internalized the message that purity, both moral and ritual, demanded vigilance. The lessons were subtle yet relentless. Mistakes were intolerable. Observation was constant. The cost of failure, ultimate. Every ritual, every law, every public homage reinforced the invisible architecture of control. Even now, millennia later, the image of the Vestal Virgin endures, not merely as a historical curiosity, but as a symbol of tension between human life and institutional authority. She embodies the paradox of exaltation and imprisonment, the fragile line between honor and annihilation. To gaze upon her story is to confront the price paid when a society elevates symbols above people, when devotion is weaponized, and when fear is codified into law. And yet, for all the silence, the terror, and the ritualized destruction, one question persists. How does a civilization measure the worth of a life it claims to protect while simultaneously condemning it to death? The answer lies buried beneath Rome itself, in earth and memory, where the echoes of Vestals whisper lessons Rome will never fully hear. By the time the empire was enveloped in the shadows of late antiquity, the Vestals had become ghosts in the memory of Rome, their lives a testament to the city's obsession with control and symbolism.
The fire of Vesta had gone out, but the architecture of fear remained, etched into law, ritual, and social expectation. The lessons learned from their discipline, obedience above desire, surveillance above trust, punishment above mercy, had been absorbed into the Roman psyche. Generations had been shaped by the knowledge that perfection demanded sacrifice, and that failure, however slight, could summon death itself. The city's response to crisis had always been intimate and internal. In times of famine, plague, or military disaster, The Romans did not immediately look to generals or senators. They looked to the sacred order they could control. The Vestal Virgin was both shield and scapegoat. By holding her accountable, the city reassured itself that divine favor could be restored. In this, the Vestals became more than priestesses. They were living instruments of civic psychology, conduits through which Rome attempted to bend fate to law. Yet this control was a fragile illusion. Human endurance has limits, even when sanctified. Those who survived decades in service carried invisible scars, mental architectures built of fear, obedience, and relentless self-surveillance. Few could escape without being haunted. Even freedom, after 30 years of confinement and ritualized expectation, was a landscape of disorientation and anxiety. The world beyond the Atrium Vestae had not changed, but the survivor had been irrevocably reshaped. In the rare cases where former Vestals married, bore children, or participated in public life, their presence reminded others that the institution's power extended beyond life and into psyche. The rituals themselves, as horrifying as they were precise, reveal Rome's understanding of symbolism and mortality. Burial alive was not mere cruelty, it was law, theology, and politics intertwined. By leaving the condemned with minimal sustenance, Rome absolved itself while asserting dominion. The silent execution erased both the person and the error from public consciousness, ensuring that society could believe in both justice and divine favor simultaneously. In a single act, Rome reconciled fear, law, and religion into a seamless instrument of control. In studying these women, one confronts the collision of reverence and terror. The Vestal Virgin was at once exalted and expendable, celebrated and threatened, alive in the public eye, yet vulnerable to annihilation in silence.
Her story forces reflection on the limits of obedience, the cost of symbolic perfection, and the human consequences of a civilization willing to sanctify terror in the guise of devotion. The final chapter of the Vestal story is not one of ceremony or spectacle, but of echoes and reflection. By the time the Atrium Vestae fell silent, Rome had transformed beyond recognition. Emperors claimed divinity, the Senate's authority waned, and new religions rose to dominance. The sacred flame, once tended by trembling hands for centuries, flickered for the last time and was extinguished not by error, but by decree. And yet, the consequences of those centuries of ritual, fear, and discipline endured far longer than the fire itself. They lingered in law, in custom, in the psychological imprint on generations of women and men who had lived under the weight of the city's expectations. What remains of the Vestals is paradoxical. They were lauded as embodiments of purity, yet their lives were dictated by fear. They were revered publicly, yet punished privately, sometimes invisibly, for imagined transgressions. The story of burial alive, of scourging in darkness, of silence enforced as a weapon, endures not merely as historical fact, but as a warning. When a society elevates symbols above human lives, cruelty becomes invisible, normalized, and sanctified. Rome's reverence for law and virtue masked the moral compromises at its heart, and the Vestal Virgin, in her whitened robes, was the most intimate witness to that truth. Even in death, the state preserved its absolution. The Campus Sceleratus, where the condemned were buried alive, left no public trace. Names were erased. Memory was sealed under earth and stone. Yet in erasing her, Rome preserved the system. Reverence for the symbol, fear of failure, and the invisible machinery of control continued to define civic life. Those who survived their service bore scars no law could measure, carrying the trauma of obedience, the terror of perfection, and the knowledge that even sanctity could be punished. The Vestal Virgin reminds us that history is not only about wars, empires, or conquests. It is about control, sacrifice, and the human cost of institutionalized fear. Her story illuminates the tension between honor and terror, freedom and obedience, public worship and private suffering.
It forces reflection on the power of symbols, the consequences of perfection demanded without mercy, and the fragility of life when bound to law and ritual. In the end, Rome survived,
But the Vestals, buried in earth or memory, ask a question that echoes across millennia. How much cruelty can a civilization sanctify in the name of virtue before it loses its own humanity? Their answer, silent and eternal, remains buried beneath the stones of the city, where the fire once burned, and where fear, above all, endured.